I never thought it would come to this. My childhood home, the place where I grew up, where memories of my family's laughter echoed through the halls, was suddenly at the center of a battle I never saw coming. It was a place I had always taken for granted, a solid foundation that I assumed would be with me forever. But that was before I realized what my sister, Emma, had done. It all began when I left the country for my studies. A mix of ambition and adventure took me far from home, but I always stayed in touch. Emma and I weren't particularly close, but we shared a history, a common bond. I thought, despite our differences, we could always rely on each other. But during my absence, Emma began to see the house differently, not as the family home, but as a potential asset. The house was a modest, two-story building in the suburbs. It wasn't anything extravagant, but it was our family's pride and joy. My parents had bought it when they were young, and the years of memories it held meant everything to me. But Emma, being the more business-minded of the two of us, started making plans of her own. I had no idea, at the time, that she was playing a much darker game behind the scenes. While I was in a foreign country, dealing with the challenges of life away from home, Emma was back in our childhood town, working tirelessly on something I would never have suspected. She wasn't one to share much with me during our sporadic conversations, but something about the way she spoke in those months struck me as off. She had always been confident, but now there was an air of something else, something I couldn't quite place. As time went on, I noticed changes in the way she spoke about the house. She started mentioning how she was taking care of things, how she was keeping everything in order. Her tone was too casual, as if she had taken control of something that was never really hers to begin with. One day, out of nowhere, I received a message from an old neighbor. It was a simple text: "I don't know if you know, but your sister is selling the house." At first, I thought it was a mistake or some misunderstanding. There was no way Emma would be doing such a thing, especially without consulting me. But as I sat there, staring at the text, a chilling thought crossed my mind: what if Emma had found a way to take the house for herself while I was away? I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the seed of doubt had been planted. I tried calling Emma, but she didn't pick up. The silence was deafening, and a growing unease began to settle in my chest. Could it be true? Could my sister really be stealing our childhood home? I had to know for sure. The next few weeks were a blur of frantic searching, calls to old family friends, and distant relatives. I needed to gather evidence, to understand if Emma had really taken control of the house. It wasn't just about the property, it was about my family's legacy, the memories we had all shared within those walls. But no one had any solid answers. It wasn't until I reached out to an old lawyer friend of my father's that I began to see the truth. He had been a part of the initial paperwork when our parents had bought the house, and he was the one who had handled the legalities after their passing. When I explained my suspicions, he hesitated for a moment before telling me something that made my blood run cold. "Ben," he said, his voice grim, "I'm afraid you're too late. Your sister has already claimed ownership of the house." The shock hit me like a punch to the gut. How could this have happened? I had no idea how, but somehow, Emma had found a way to claim what was rightfully mine. And now, with the house in her hands, she was preparing to sell it for a huge profit. I wasn't about to let that happen. Emma may have had the legal paperwork, but I had something she didn't: patience and determination. I had no intention of letting her get away with this. This was my home, my legacy, and I wasn't going to let her profit from my family's history. But the path ahead was unclear. How could I take back what was mine without the law turning against me? How could I expose Emma's deceit without putting myself at risk? I had to wait. The perfect opportunity would come. It was only a matter of time. The next few months passed in a blur. I was far from home, hundreds of miles away in a foreign country, yet the weight of what was happening back in my childhood town never left me. I couldn't focus fully on my studies. Every time I opened my textbooks or tried to concentrate on a lecture, my mind wandered back to that house. The thought of my sister, Emma, unlawfully claiming ownership of it made my stomach turn. But I knew I couldn't act rashly. I needed concrete evidence, something I could use against her. Emma, being as crafty as she was, wouldn't leave any obvious paper trail. She'd likely found a way to manipulate the system, exploiting legal loopholes that I was not yet aware of. I had to dig deeper, far beyond surface-level assumptions. I started researching property laws and ownership claims from thousands of miles away. I spent countless hours reading up on estate laws, inheritance rights, and fraudulent property claims. I couldn't afford to make a single mistake when I confronted her, and without a full understanding of how she had managed to claim the house, I would be powerless. It was during one late-night session on my laptop that I stumbled across something crucial. My father had left behind a detailed will, one that mentioned the house specifically. It was a standard will, a simple document, but the terms were clear: the house was to remain with me, Ben, as the only surviving heir. There was no mention of Emma inheriting anything. But then, I found the loophole. While my father's will had explicitly mentioned that I was the sole heir to the property, it seemed Emma had found a technicality. It turned out that there had been a clerical error when the property was transferred to my name after my parents' passing. The paperwork had been filed incorrectly, and the house was listed under both my name and Emma's, a mistake that had gone unnoticed for years. It was a small error, almost insignificant at first glance, but it created a huge opportunity for Emma. Armed with this mistake, she had approached the bank, the county office, and even some local real estate agents, exploiting the loophole to claim full ownership of the house. With nothing more than the simple clerical error, she had managed to bypass any legal claims I could have made. I couldn't believe it. Emma had used a mistake, a tiny slip in the system, to secure her claim. She had filed the necessary documents, forged signatures, and presented the house as entirely hers. There was no clear trace of fraud, nothing that could easily be proven in court, at least not immediately. If I wanted to fight her, I would need more than just the knowledge of this mistake. I needed proof of her actions. The more I thought about it, the more disgusted I became. Emma hadn't just exploited a loophole, she had actively manipulated the system to secure something that wasn't hers. Her actions went beyond opportunism, they were deliberate, cold, and calculated. And I had to expose her, but I couldn't afford to make any mistakes. I began reaching out to contacts back home, those who had known Emma for years. I sent discreet messages to friends of the family, hoping someone would have seen something that would help me. Slowly, bits and pieces of Emma's scheme started to come together. One of the family friends mentioned a strange conversation she had overheard between Emma and a real estate agent. Apparently, Emma had spoken about selling the house for a significant profit, far more than what it was worth when my parents had bought it. It was clear that Emma had been preparing the house for sale long before I had even started to look into things. But even with this information, I still didn't have enough to take direct action. I needed something undeniable. I needed a witness who could testify that Emma had acted fraudulently. That's when I reached out to an old family lawyer who had worked on my parents' estate. He had retired, but I knew he would understand the gravity of the situation. After explaining everything to him, he agreed to meet. We met in a small cafe, away from the prying eyes of Emma's circle. Over a cup of coffee, he listened intently to my story and then pulled out some old files. He'd kept a record of my parents' will and the original property documents, including the flawed paperwork. "Ben," he said, lowering his voice, "it's clear Emma's been playing a dangerous game. But the law doesn't always act quickly. You need to move carefully, and you need to be prepared for a long fight." I felt a mix of relief and anxiety. At least now, I had a legal expert on my side, and more importantly, someone who could help me gather the evidence I needed to take action. The battle was far from over, but now I had a clearer picture of what I was dealing with. Emma had made her move, but I was ready to make mine. However, I had to be strategic. Time was not on my side, and I needed to wait for the perfect opportunity to strike. Emma's plan to sell the house would be her undoing, she just didn't know it yet. The days following my meeting with the family lawyer were filled with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. I had gathered the evidence I needed, but it still wasn't enough to act decisively. The plan was clear: wait for the right moment, and when Emma made her move, I would be ready to strike. Emma had been so careful in covering her tracks, and now she was preparing to sell the house. This was her big mistake. She had no idea that I was already one step ahead, watching from afar. The house was her ticket to a significant windfall, and she had no intention of backing out now. It was tempting to confront her directly, but I knew that would only alert her to the fact that I was onto her. Instead, I had to make sure she walked right into my trap. The weeks dragged on, each day filled with an ever-growing sense of urgency. I spent my time reading up on property laws, case studies of fraudulent claims, and loopholes people had exploited in similar situations. I couldn't afford to make a mistake. This had to be foolproof. I needed to understand not only how Emma had manipulated the system, but also how I could use the system against her. While I waited, I continued to follow Emma's every move, using the contacts I had back home to keep tabs on her. The real estate agent she had been working with was one of her closest allies, and I suspected they had been in cahoots from the very beginning. Emma was meticulous, and she didn't leave anything to chance. One evening, I received a phone call from an old friend who worked in local government. She had been keeping an eye on the case and had heard rumors about Emma's plans. "Ben, I think your sister's finalizing the sale of the house," she said. "She's getting the paperwork ready. If you want to stop her, now's the time." I felt my heart race. The moment I had been waiting for was here. Emma had made her move, and I had the opportunity to expose her deceit before it was too late. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but I still needed to be careful. One wrong move, and I could lose everything. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was about to come. I had spent months preparing for this moment, and now the time had come to expose my sister for what she truly was, a fraud. But how could I make sure my actions didn't backfire? The key was subtlety. I couldn't risk directly confronting Emma or making it obvious that I was involved. I had to use the system to my advantage. That's when I decided to reach out to the authorities, but I couldn't do it in a way that would immediately tie me to the tip-off. I needed to keep my identity secret and ensure that the investigation would proceed without interference. The local authorities had a fraud division, and I knew they would take this case seriously. But I couldn't just send a tip. I needed to provide them with enough evidence to make them act. I spent the next few days compiling everything I had learned about Emma's fraudulent activities. I had the flawed property documents, the overheard conversations, and the testimony from the family lawyer who had helped me uncover the loophole. But most importantly, I had the real kicker, a copy of the sales agreement Emma had signed with the real estate agent, which detailed the inflated price she planned to sell the house for. Once everything was in place, I sent an anonymous tip to the authorities, providing them with the key pieces of evidence. I made sure to keep my involvement completely hidden, ensuring that the investigation would be conducted independently of me. All I had to do now was wait and watch as the authorities took action. I knew Emma wouldn't see it coming. She was so confident that her plan would succeed, that she had no idea that the walls were closing in on her. I had set everything in motion, and now I just had to sit back and let the investigation unfold. The days turned into weeks, but I kept a close eye on Emma's activities. She seemed oblivious to the fact that the authorities were starting to look into her. I wondered how long it would take her to realize that her scheme was unraveling, but I wasn't in a rush. I had waited this long, what was a little more time? I could almost hear her thinking that everything was going according to plan, unaware that the truth was about to catch up with her. But I had learned one valuable lesson during all this: patience. The perfect moment had arrived, and now, I would watch as the storm I had set in motion would wash away everything she had worked for. It was only a matter of time before Emma would be forced to answer for her betrayal. In the quiet of my room, far from the home I once knew, I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. This was just the beginning. It had been 2 weeks since I sent the anonymous tip, and I was starting to feel the tension in the air. It wasn't a loud, obvious tension, but rather a quiet, creeping sense of something about to break. I could almost hear the silence growing louder as the days passed, each one bringing me closer to the moment I had been anticipating for so long. But even then, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was missing. I had done everything right. I had carefully planted the evidence, made sure the tip-off was discreet, and ensured the authorities had everything they needed to start an investigation. But for some reason, it felt like I was still on the outside looking in, waiting for something to happen. Then, one morning, everything changed. I received an unexpected phone call from my lawyer. He had been following up with the authorities and had just been informed that the investigation was moving forward. Apparently, Emma had started to panic. She wasn't as confident as she had been when she first launched her scheme. The authorities had uncovered discrepancies in the sale paperwork, and it had quickly escalated into a full-fledged investigation. Emma's carefully constructed web of lies was beginning to unravel. "You're making progress," my lawyer said. "The authorities are taking the case seriously, but they're going to need more. You'll need to come back to finalize the case and be prepared to testify." I had always known this moment would come, but hearing it from my lawyer made it real. The investigation was no longer just something I was watching from afar, it was happening, and I was at the center of it. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of urgency. My sister was in deep, and there was no way out for her now. It wasn't just about the house anymore, it was about justice, and I was determined to see it through. But as I prepared to make my way back home, a new thought occurred to me: what if Emma knew I was involved? What if she had pieced things together and figured out that I was the one who had exposed her? I couldn't afford to take any risks. I had to make sure she never suspected I was behind this. So, I did what I could to keep my involvement under the radar. I made sure my lawyer kept everything as low-key as possible, staying out of the spotlight. The last thing I needed was for Emma to make a desperate move before the authorities could close in. By the time I arrived back in my hometown, the investigation was already well underway. I made contact with the authorities and provided them with the final pieces of evidence that would ensure Emma couldn't escape the consequences of her actions. The authorities had everything they needed now, and I felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that Emma would finally face the consequences of her greed. But the hardest part was still ahead. I had to confront my sister, my own flesh and blood. I had spent so many years keeping my distance, but now I would have to face her in person, knowing that everything had changed. I wasn't sure what kind of person she would be once the truth came out. Would she deny everything? Would she try to manipulate the situation, as she always had? I wasn't sure, but I knew one thing for sure: this was no longer about family. This was about exposing the truth, no matter what the cost. I didn't know what would happen next, but I was prepared for whatever came my way. Emma had stolen my home, my memories, my family's legacy, but now I had stolen something far more powerful: the truth. And once it was out there, there was no going back. I waited. I watched. The final confrontation was coming, and I could feel it in the air. It was just a matter of time. The day I had been both dreading and anticipating arrived sooner than I expected. I had spent so much time in the shadows, gathering evidence, sending anonymous tips, and waiting for the authorities to act. But now, it was all about to come to a head. The news came from my lawyer first. Emma was being questioned by the authorities. Her calm exterior, the one she had so carefully maintained for years, was finally beginning to crack. She had no idea that the walls were closing in, and the fact that her fraudulent actions were now under official scrutiny made her nervous. I decided it was time to pay her a visit. This wasn't going to be some dramatic confrontation. I wasn't going to yell or accuse her, no, I had planned something more calculated. I needed her to see that she had been caught, to witness firsthand the consequences of her greed. And most importantly, I needed to watch her face when the truth hit her. I showed up at her apartment unannounced. The look of surprise on her face when she opened the door said it all. She clearly hadn't been expecting me, especially not after everything that had transpired. Emma stood there, frozen for a moment, before she regained her composure. She invited me in, and I could see the wheels turning in her mind, trying to figure out what I knew. We sat down in her living room, the atmosphere heavy with tension. I didn't speak immediately, letting the silence linger. Emma shifted in her seat, her fingers tapping nervously on the armrest. She knew something was off, but she didn't know exactly what. "Ben," she finally said, her voice feigning nonchalance, "it's been a while. How's everything going on your end?" I could see the familiar charm in her voice, but beneath it, there was a subtle nervousness. She was trying to act like everything was fine, but I knew better. She had no idea that I knew everything. I leaned forward slightly, meeting her gaze. "You know, Emma," I began, keeping my voice calm and steady, "I've been following what you've been up to. You've really outdone yourself this time." Her eyes widened slightly, but she quickly recovered. "What are you talking about?" she said, her tone forced and defensive. I didn't answer her immediately. Instead, I pulled out a folder I had brought with me. Inside were copies of the fraudulent property documents she had submitted, the emails between her and the real estate agent, and the sales contract that detailed the inflated price she intended to sell the house for. I placed the folder in front of her. She stared at it, her face paling as she recognized the contents. The silence between us stretched longer this time. She didn't know how to react, she knew I had her cornered, and the shock was evident in her eyes. "I don't know what you think you have, Ben," she said, trying to regain some control. "But you're wrong. You don't have anything on me." I smiled softly, my patience finally wearing thin. "That's where you're wrong, Emma. I've got everything. The evidence is clear, and the authorities are already involved. It's over. You've stolen from me, from the family, and now you're going to have to face the consequences." For the first time in years, I saw Emma genuinely shaken. The confident, calculating woman who had always been one step ahead was now a mere shell of her former self. She tried to gather her composure, but I could see the panic in her eyes. She was no longer in control. "You wouldn't do this to me," she whispered, almost pleading. "We're family, Ben. You can't just take everything from me." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Family?" I shot back, my voice rising. "You betrayed me, Emma. You stole our home, our history, everything our parents worked for. And now you're trying to sell it for a profit. How dare you even talk about family?" Her expression shifted, her defenses crumbling. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, she simply sat there, defeated, knowing that there was no way out. She had been caught, and there was no one to protect her anymore. "I didn't think you had it in you, Ben," she said quietly, almost as if speaking to herself. "I thought you were too naive, too trusting." I leaned back, my gaze fixed on her. "I was trusting, Emma, but I wasn't naive. I just didn't expect my own sister to go this far." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then Emma broke down, her tears coming in quiet sobs. She had spent so much time hiding behind a facade, pretending everything was fine, but now the weight of her actions had caught up to her. I could see the guilt and regret in her eyes, but it was too late for apologies. She had crossed a line, and now she had to face the consequences. I stood up, feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. "I've already done what I had to do, Emma. The house is no longer yours to sell. The authorities are involved, and you'll have to answer for what you've done." I walked to the door, pausing for a moment before turning back to her. "I don't know if there's any way to repair what's been broken between us. But I know this much, you'll never get away with this." With that, I left her there, alone with the consequences of her actions. As I stepped outside, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't over yet, but the hardest part was done. Emma's scheme had been exposed, and there was no way she could deny it now. The investigation was moving forward, and Emma would soon face the consequences of her betrayal. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. But I knew this was just the beginning. The real battle was still ahead. The next few days after my confrontation with Emma were filled with a kind of surreal quiet. I had exposed her actions, confronted her face to face, and now the truth was out in the open. But despite the relief that I felt from finally having done something, I couldn't shake the growing anticipation of what would come next. Emma, now reeling from the weight of her actions, became elusive. I didn't hear from her, and part of me wondered if she was already working on a way to manipulate the situation. But I couldn't afford to be complacent. The authorities were investigating, but the process wasn't moving as quickly as I had hoped. I had hoped the pressure would force her into making a mistake, but instead, she was just staying quiet, hiding from the truth. It wasn't until a week later that I received the call that would change everything. My lawyer contacted me, his voice grave and serious. "Ben, the authorities have made their move. The fraud is undeniable, and they're pressing charges. They've already seized the documents and are looking into her financial records." It was happening. Emma was going to be charged for what she had done, and the house would finally be returned to me. I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, satisfaction, and a sharp, cold sense of justice finally being served. But at the same time, something in my gut told me this wouldn't be as simple as it seemed. The charges against Emma were serious. Fraudulent property claims, tampering with official documents, and illegal sale of a family property. It was a web of deceit, and she was at the center of it. The authorities had gathered enough evidence to charge her, and there was no way she could talk her way out of it. But what struck me as strange was her lack of reaction. Normally, Emma was calculating, always scheming, always moving. Yet, this time, she didn't seem to be fighting back. She was silent. The next few weeks were a blur. The investigation continued, and Emma's fate hung in the balance. I stayed in constant contact with my lawyer, ensuring I was kept up to date on the developments. Despite the mounting evidence, it seemed like Emma wasn't going to face justice without a fight. She had hired a team of high-powered lawyers, desperate to find a loophole, to discredit the evidence, or to delay the trial. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew one thing for certain: Emma had underestimated me. For years, she had thought she could outsmart everyone, including me. She had always been the one in control, the one who had manipulated everyone around her, including our parents. But this time, she had made a mistake. This time, I was prepared. The authorities were now closing in. They had seized the house, putting it under investigation for any further fraudulent transactions, and they were scrutinizing every single document Emma had submitted. The once profitable sale she had been planning was now a black mark on her record. Every attempt to move forward was blocked, and the house, our family home, was no longer hers to sell. I had reclaimed what was rightfully mine. But there was one final step: Emma would need to face the consequences of her actions in court. The trial date was set. I knew it would be a difficult process, but I was prepared for whatever was coming. Emma would have to face the law, and there would be no getting out of it. No more legal loopholes, no more hiding behind clever manipulation. This was the end of her scheme. The day of the trial arrived, and I found myself sitting in the courtroom, my heart pounding with a mix of emotions. I hadn't seen Emma since that day I confronted her at her apartment. Her usual bravado was gone, replaced with a quiet defeat. She looked smaller somehow, her usual confident posture slumped. As she entered the courtroom, she tried to avoid eye contact, but I could feel the weight of everything between us. As the trial began, I couldn't help but notice how different Emma seemed. She was no longer the confident, ruthless woman who had once been so sure of her control. Now, she was a woman backed into a corner, fighting to hold on to whatever was left of her dignity. But the evidence was undeniable. The forged documents, the manipulated property transfers, the fraudulent sale, each piece of evidence stacked against her like a heavy weight. The prosecutor laid out the case, detailing every step of Emma's illegal actions. I sat in silence, my mind racing as I heard the full extent of what she had done. This wasn't just about the house. It was about everything Emma had done over the years, the manipulation, the lies, the way she had destroyed everything we had as a family for her own gain. When it was finally my turn to testify, I walked up to the stand with a calm resolve. I had nothing left to lose, and everything to gain. I explained the history of the house, the mistake in the paperwork, and how Emma had exploited it for her own benefit. I spoke of my years of suspicion, my painstaking research, and my decision to finally expose the truth. My words were clear, measured, and precise. Emma sat there, her face pale, her eyes fixed on the ground. She didn't speak, didn't try to argue. It was clear that the fight was over. She knew it, I knew it, and the entire courtroom knew it. The evidence was overwhelming. By the end of the day, the judge had made his ruling. Emma was found guilty of all charges: fraud, theft, and illegal transfer of property. The punishment would be severe. But as I watched her crumble, I felt a strange sense of finality. She had taken something precious from me, but now, it was mine again. The house would be returned to me, and Emma would face the consequences of her actions. As I left the courtroom that day, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led up to this moment. The house, the memories, the betrayal, the patience, it had all brought me here. And while I had won, I knew that the real battle had always been about something much deeper: justice, family, and reclaiming what was mine. But I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel victorious. All I felt was a quiet sense of peace, knowing that the truth had come to light, and Emma had no more secrets to hide. The storm had broken, and the damage had been done. But in the end, I had reclaimed my home. The trial was over. Emma had been convicted, and justice had been served. But even though I had won, the aftermath wasn't as simple as I had imagined. The house, our family's legacy, was now officially back in my hands, but the emotional toll of everything that had happened still weighed heavily on me. I had fought for what was mine, but in doing so, I had lost so much more. I spent the first few days after the trial trying to process everything. The house was mine again, but it felt strange walking through those familiar rooms, knowing the betrayal that had taken place. Each corner of the house held memories, not just of my childhood, but of the years I had spent away, trusting my sister to do the right thing. It was painful to think that Emma had been living in the same house, planning her scheme, plotting behind my back. The walls seemed to echo with the history of our family, and yet there was an undeniable emptiness in them now. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been lost forever. The home I had once thought would always be there, a symbol of stability and comfort, had become a battleground. The house was mine again, but the price of winning it back had been high. I decided to start cleaning out the house, going through my parents' old belongings and the things that had accumulated over the years. It felt like a necessary step, a way to close the door on this chapter of my life. I couldn't keep looking back at what had happened, at how Emma had stolen something so sacred to us. I needed to reclaim not just the property, but the memories. As I sifted through the boxes of old photographs, letters, and mementos, I found myself reflecting on everything that had led up to this moment. I thought about my parents, how they had worked so hard to build a life for us, to make sure we had everything we needed. And I thought about Emma, the sister I had grown up with, the person I had once trusted above all others. How could she have done this? How could she have betrayed me so completely? But then, as I stood there, surrounded by the remnants of our past, I realized something important: I couldn't let Emma's betrayal define everything. Yes, she had wronged me, and yes, the trust between us was shattered beyond repair. But this house, this legacy, was still part of me. It was a part of who I was, and it belonged to the family that came before me. Emma might have tried to take it, but she couldn't take the meaning it held. The house was a symbol of our past, but it was also a foundation for my future. The next few weeks were filled with a mixture of quiet reflection and necessary paperwork. I had to finalize the legal documents, ensure the house was properly transferred back into my name, and deal with the financial fallout of Emma's fraudulent actions. But through it all, I felt a sense of resolution. The battle had been long, but I had fought for what was rightfully mine. And now, it was time to move forward. But even as I worked through the logistics of reclaiming the house, a nagging thought kept pulling at the back of my mind: what would happen to Emma now? She had been convicted, but what would her life look like after the trial? Her future was uncertain, and I couldn't help but wonder how she would cope with the consequences of her actions. It wasn't that I felt sorry for her, not after everything she had done. But there was a part of me that still saw her as the sister I had once known. The same sister who had shared a home with me, the one who had once laughed with me around the dinner table. I knew it was foolish, but I couldn't entirely erase those memories. The days went by, and eventually, I heard word of Emma's sentence. She would serve time, but the sentence was far lighter than I had expected. It wasn't as much about the time she would spend behind bars, though. What struck me was the isolation that would come with it. The betrayal she had caused wasn't just something that affected me, it had affected our entire family. There would be no coming back from this. Even if she were to serve her sentence and eventually be free, the trust she had broken could never be repaired. I found myself contemplating what the future held, not just for me, but for everyone who had been touched by this. The house was back in my hands, but the damage to our family dynamic couldn't be undone. Emma had made her choices, and now she would have to live with the consequences. But for me, the journey was far from over. I had won the house back, but the path ahead was still unclear. I had always thought that reclaiming the house would bring me peace, that it would be the final step in putting everything right. But the truth was, the house was just the beginning. I had to rebuild, not just my home, but my life. I had to find a way to move forward, to let go of the anger and betrayal that had consumed me for so long. As I walked through the house that day, I realized that it wasn't about the walls, the rooms, or even the property itself. It was about what I chose to make of it. It was about finding peace, not in the house, but within myself. I couldn't change the past, but I could choose how to move forward. The storm had broken, but I still had a long way to go. The road ahead was uncertain, but I knew one thing: would rebuild, would heal, and I would create a future that was mine, untouched by betrayal, and filled with the possibility of something new. The dust was finally settling, both literally and figuratively. The legal matters surrounding the house were resolved. The house that had been so carelessly ripped away from me, the one I had thought would always be there as a part of my family's history, was finally back where it belonged. But what I hadn't expected, what no one could have prepared me for, was the weight of the journey that still lay ahead. Emma's betrayal was not just an isolated event, it was a wound that cut deep, far deeper than I had initially realized. For years, I had looked at her as family, and family was supposed to be the one thing that was untouchable. She was the one person I thought I could rely on, and the fact that she had stolen from me, stolen our home, our memories, shattered something in me that wasn't so easily mended. The house stood before me, silent, waiting to be filled with life again. I moved back in, of course, but there was a strange emptiness in every corner. The furniture felt too foreign, even though it was all mine. The walls held the ghosts of happier times, times that now felt like they belonged to someone else. I spent my days going through the motions, filling out paperwork, dealing with the endless legalities of property transfer and ownership. There were contractors to deal with, repairs to oversee, and, of course, the final cleanup of the house after Emma's brief time there. But beyond all of the physical work, beyond the paint and the renovation, the real task was one I hadn't anticipated: learning how to live in a house that had once been a home. I had to come to terms with the fact that it would never be the same again. The memories I had cherished as a child had been tainted by Emma's actions, and that was something I couldn't undo. As I walked through the old house, I thought about my parents, what they would have wanted for me, for the family. They would have wanted us to stay close, to protect each other, to hold the house as a symbol of our love and unity. But Emma had torn that bond apart, and now, I was left picking up the pieces. The hardest part wasn't even the legal battle or the betrayal, it was the realization that family didn't mean what it used to. My parents were gone, and Emma was a stranger. The familiar faces I had once relied on were now ghosts, and I was standing here, alone, in the midst of it all. But as I walked through the house, I began to realize something. I didn't have to let Emma's actions define me or define the house. It was mine, yes, but it was more than that. It was a symbol of resilience, of my ability to fight back, to reclaim what was mine, and to move forward, no matter the cost. I didn't have to live in the shadow of her betrayal. I had the power to create new memories, to reshape the space into something that was truly mine again. So, I started with small things. I replaced the broken pieces of furniture that Emma had left behind. I started fixing up the rooms, repainting the walls in colors that made me feel at peace. It wasn't easy, but every brushstroke, every repair, felt like I was taking back a piece of my life. I wasn't just fixing the house, I was fixing myself. Slowly but surely, the house began to feel like home again. It wasn't perfect, and it would never be exactly what it had been before, but it was mine. And with each passing day, I found myself at peace with that. Emma's betrayal, as painful as it had been, had not destroyed me. It had made me stronger. It had forced me to confront parts of myself I had long ignored and given me the opportunity to rebuild something greater than what I had lost. I started spending more time with the people who mattered, the friends who had supported me, the family who had stood by me. I realized that I had been so focused on reclaiming the house that I had forgotten the true value of what was important. It wasn't the property. It wasn't the material possessions or the memories attached to the house. It was the relationships I had, the people who had stood by me when I needed them the most. The day finally came when I was able to sit on the porch of the house, looking out at the yard. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over the property. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything I had been through lift just a little bit. The house was still here. It was still mine. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was starting to live again. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I was ready for it. The storm had passed, and I had survived. The house was back in my hands, but more importantly, I had learned how to stand on my own again. Emma may have taken the house, but she couldn't take everything from me. And as I watched the sun dip below the horizon, I knew that this was just the beginning. I had a future to build. It was my future. And this time, nothing would stand in my way.